Hello, and welcome to the first lesson of the Unity camp tutorial thing, whatever you want to call this. I don't know the right terminology for it. So first thing we're going to do is create a new project. So you're going to hit the new button, and it's going to give you all of these options. You'll get this. First thing you had to do was basically make a microgame, and then it'll give you access to the project screen here. But since we've done that in the tutorial, it'll give you all of these options here, and we're going to go ahead and click on 2D. You can call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it the camp tutorial. And the location, you should have a desktop unit, or it could be wherever your Unity folder is. And then under the repos, if you don't have that, you can very simply just create it. Otherwise, you can just create the file. Okay, so it is finished loading, at least for me. I fast forwarded through that kind of lengthy loading process. It took me around a minute to load. But here we have Unity, and I'll go through what everything is. On the left here, there's basically everything in the scene. So that's like any characters, any platforms, any enemies, all of that will be right here in the scene, which includes the first thing that'll be there is the camera, so that's what you see. Here, you can drag it over, is the scene. So the scene is basically just, you can add things, edit them, and then the game here is what you will see when you're actually playing the game. So you could really move anywhere around on the scene, but this is what the player will be seeing when they're playing the game. Over here we have the asset store. You have to have an internet connection in order to access the asset store. And that's basically if you need to download any assets, which I'm pretty sure we will be doing later in the course. You can just find them here. And there's a lot of good assets and a lot of free assets too. Down here, we basically have our folders. So here we have assets, and inside assets, we have the scenes folder. So scenes are really just levels. Right now, there's only one, which is the scene up right now. But first thing we're going to do underneath the assets is create a new folder, and we're going to call this prefabs. And a prefab is basically just a saved object. So if there's something that you want to create in a game and then use it later, like for example a collectible or some kind of platform, you would put it in the prefab folder. And then we're going to create one other folder for the start and call it scripts. And we'll get into scripts a lot more next lesson. Perhaps we'll touch on them a little bit at the end of this one. But scripts are basically they're code, and it's pretty much what they sound like. They're scripts that the objects follow for when they're actually performing in game. Over here, you may have this up, you may not. This is just something I have personally set up, is the animation and animator. We can actually get rid of those if you have it there. You probably won't when you start it up. Sometimes it'll start with that, sometimes it won't. Depends on whatever preferences you have set. But we don't really need that for now. Now over here we have the inspector, console, and project settings. And if you don't have project settings, you can just go to edit and then just hit project settings right here. And I will actually show a better example. If you go to edit, project settings, it'll bring it up, and then you can I like to have mine, I like to drag it and basically put it as one of these three. So inspector is basically it's the inspector for any object, which we'll get into in a bit. Consoles we'll get into more next lesson when we start coding. And then project settings has things like input, the physics, all of that. You probably won't have TextMesh Pro in yet, unless, at least when I started doing Unity, it wasn't included. I know some things are now. But we don't need to import that right now. So yeah, we're gonna start off by creating an empty object. So you right click under sample scene and you're gonna hit create empty. So there we go. Now if we go to inspector, we can basically see anything about the empty object we created. So that's sort of it right there. And currently the only thing is transform. And a good habit to get into is that it'll just pretty much place the object. I'm not sure the math behind why it's placing it in the spot it does, but you can right click and hit reset. Now under transform we have position, so there's an X and a Y coordinate. X just moves it horizontally, and then Y is vertically. At any point, you can hit Control Z or Command Z on Mac to undo something. Rotation will spin it, which we can't really see right now. And then scale is just how big or small it is, which again, it's not connected to anything, so we can't see. The one thing that isn't really that important in a 2D game is the Z-axis. So X would be horizontal, Y would be vertical, and then Z is sort of back and forth. But in a 2D game, you don't really have a Z-axis to work with, so we're not really going to pay too close attention to that. But the first thing we're going to add is we're going to actually make our component visible. So hit Add Component, and we're going to type in Sprite Renderer, this one right here. And under Sprite, you're going to hit this little dot to select, and you can select any. We haven't imported any sprites yet, but there's a whole selection here. I'm going with this one right here. And now you can kind of see it appear there. If we zoom in on our scene, then we can see it. So now we have our sprite in. Let's make it a bit bigger. So we'll take the X scale and we can really start stretching it out. And then we'll stretch the Y out as well. So you can see what the game view is here. You could also, if you want, take the game and sort of move it along here so you can swap between the two. Which I think would be, when you're starting, that might be a good thing to do, so you're not constantly like shifting back and forth between two different smaller views. But I've always kind of preferred to just have a little game in the corner right here, so you can kind of always see what the player would see. Now with the sprite here, it's pretty much just an empty sprite, so it doesn't have a hitbox, doesn't have any properties. If we hit play to see what'll happen, absolutely nothing happens. It's just staying still, not moving at all. And the reason for that is because it doesn't really exist in the world. We can see it, but it's not really there. So to basically say, hey, this thing in this game exists, we have to create a rigid body. So we can type that in. And there's two options. There's rigid body and there's rigid body 2D. We're going to go with the rigid body 2D since this is a 2D game. It's definitely a lot simpler than with the 3D game, so it's a good place to start. And right here we have a load of options. Now the first option that it'll automatically set to is dynamic, so that means it'll move. So now if we hit play, it'll start to fall. And that's because we have gravity that's interfering with it. Some things we can change are the mass, so that's basically how much it weighs. If you've taken physics, you know that mass and gravity don't really affect each other. However, the mass is important for if you say you want to move something. So if you have a player moving a block or something like that, then the higher the mass, the longer it'll take the move. One thing we can change, though, is the gravity scale. Right now it's on 1, but if we change that to, say, a 10, then it's going to fall much faster. You can see it's really quickly falling down there. And then, for example, on the other hand, if we made this 0.3, it's going to fall very slowly. Lastly, what you can do, and you're not really going to do this much because there's a better option, is set the gravity scale to 0, and that will basically just make it so there's no gravity affecting that option. Because what this is doing is multiplying the gravity of the game, which is currently, you can change that, we'll get into later how to change the game's gravity in a future lesson, but it's multiplying it by the gravity scale, and when you multiply something by 0, it stays 0, so that's why there's no gravity affecting this object right now. However, setting a gravity scale to 0 on a dynamic isn't very common, because we have another option here called static. And static is very similar in a lot of ways to just not having the rigid body, because static objects will not move. They won't be interfered with gravity. You can't push them in the game. If there's some kind of other force that's interfering with things, it won't affect static. It's basically just there and it'll stay there. You can't move it. And then the last type, and this is sort of a bit of a more complicated type of rigid body, is kinematic. So kinematic, it brings up these options here. We can, right at the moment, we don't really need to look at those that much. We can keep them as is. But when we hit play on kinematic, nothing's going to happen. It's going to stay still. So it seems as if it's static. The difference between static and kinematic is that static will not move, period. It's basically, it'll stay there forever and nothing you can do can move it. Kinematic, on the other hand, won't be moved by forces, so like gravity, or if, say, you're pushing something, but you can move it yourself. So if you have, say, a script that tells it to move in a direction, it'll move that way. It only moves when it's told to move. Nothing else can move it, though. If that doesn't make too much sense now, it will once we get into scripting. This is just a brief rundown on the different things you can do. And then we have sprite renderer and we have rigid body. The last thing that pretty much most objects have is a collider. And we've got all of these options here. We've got box, capsule, circle. We're going to kind of go through all of them. We'll start off with box, and like the rigid bodies, there's 2D and regular ones. We're going to stick with the 2D ones. So now you see there's a little thin green outline, and that's basically the collider or the hitbox. So if we had a player, and if you pretend this mouse is the player, and there's beforehand, it would have just gone all the way through it because it wouldn't hit it. But now that there's a collider, it would hit it and stay still. So the player would not be able to fall through the block. Now we can edit the collider by hitting that. It's currently a box collider. We could move it in. We can move it out if we want to do something like that. But really, we can just keep it like this. It doesn't really matter right now. But the one thing that's gonna be important is this little check right here, the is trigger. Because when you check something as is trigger, that basically means that nothing will bump into it, but it will trigger an event. So a good example of this that I always give is the coins in Mario games. So if is trigger is checked, then you can interact with it just like Mario will interact with the coins. However, he's not moving them. Nothing's moving. They're just interacting and then they're collected. So yeah, those are the very basics of the Unity, how physics works. So now for an example, let's create another empty game object. And we were gonna go through we could go through a whole similar thing here where we'll create the sprite renderer, the rigid body, box collider. There is an easier way of doing that though. You can right click and hit delete on that. Go to this one, and just like most programs, you can hit Control C or Command C on a Mac, and then Control V or Command V, and you can paste it. So now we have two game objects. And then you can take it and move it around. So right here we've got one here and one here. And now if we hit play, nothing will happen because they're forgot about that they are both set to kinematic. So if we have this one, let's put this one on static, the old one, and the new one we'll set to dynamic, and let's see what happens. Yep, you may have also realized, for some reason it's not moving, and the reason for that is very simple. Gravity scale, it's set to 0. Let's just set that to 1, and now it should finally move. There we go. So now it fell down, but since we have the collider here, then it'll basically just fall down and hit it, and then stop. Now, say this was a trigger on this one, so it'll basically register that it collides, but it will still move through it. And there we go. It's just moving straight through the other piece. So the other thing that we should really go through are other types of colliders. So to remove a component, you can just right click and hit the remove component button right there. And now if we go to other colliders, for example a circle collider, they're all fairly self-explanatory. So this one is a circle that we can edit. Now if we set this to not is trigger and hit play, it'll stop there, and the reasoning is its big circle collider just hit that. Now, say for example, circle collider definitely doesn't seem right for this object. So if we remove it and then we add, oh, there it goes. Now that it's gone. So yeah, you can. I didn't realize it was still on play, but you can edit things while it's playing, and then when you hit play again to go back into the standard mode, it'll all reset back. So that's a good way of testing things in game. So yet now we have to remove this component again, and then we'll add a capsule collider. Now a capsule collider it looks like a circle collider at first, but then you realize that you can move it all over the place. So you can make it a circle, or if you want, you can really just start expanding like that. So at face value, this doesn't seem like the shape we're going for. However, we can change this direction here from vertical to horizontal. And now that looks a lot better. So if we move it up, try to angle this correctly, then we could potentially get a perfect fit on this object. And I'd say that looks pretty good. It's not exact. A lot of the times in games, you don't want things to be exact. They might be in a little bit. But basically, I'd say that's looking pretty good. And now if we hit play, it'll collide, and you can see it's a lot closer than it was before, now that we have a more accurate collision here. Now the last thing I want to show in this lesson is how to basically create a script. So as you can see right now, we're in the assets folder, and you can right click, hit create, and then an object you'll get is C# script. C# is just the language that we'll be using, programming language. So for example, there's Python, VB, Java, C#, and that's C#'s the one we're going to use. So we can name the script anything. The one exception is there cannot be, I believe you can't have periods in the scripts, and you can definitely not have spaces. So we'll just call this example script. And right now it's here in our assets, but we do have a folder we created just for scripts. So we can just take this and we can drag it into the scripts folder. So now when we open here, we can hit this, or we can hit on the side here and open scripts, and it's right there. So now by double clicking example scripts, assuming that based on the tutorial we set up Visual Studio to work, by double clicking it should launch Visual Studio, which you can see all the way down here. We've got it bouncing up and down trying to open, and then it should just go up right ahead and open in that. Don't worry if it takes a little while. Okay, so Visual Studio has loaded up, and we now have the start and update functions. So start is basically called whenever you start the game, that's immediately what's going to happen. And then update will happen once every frame, so anything in update will keep happening. So for example, if we type debug.log, in the next lesson we'll go into a lot more detail into some of the syntax and what a lot of the commands do. Debug.log parentheses to say what, and debug.log is basically says say this in the console. And then we do quotes to basically say that we want to say words and not other commands. And we can say, that is not how you spell hello, hello world. And then at the end of every line, we have to put a semicolon to say that's the end of the line. So right now in our script, we're not having anything at start, but every frame it'll say hello world. Now you can save it either by going to File and then Save, or by just hitting Command S or Control S. Now back in Unity, we have the script, but it's not attached to anything. To attach it is very simple. We're just going to have it on this game object. We'll do it on our original game object. And you can just take the script and drag it in. There we go. I missed it the first time. But now we have the example script in the game. So let's go to our console and see what happens. Every single frame of the game now that it's running, it'll say hello world. So that's how we know that the script is working correctly. So just a quick rundown on how this works. Back in Visual Studio, we can say debug.log. Now that's basically saying that say this into the console is debug.log, and in parentheses what you say, and then in quotes, because we're saying words, we want to say hello world, and that's it. And then we can also, if we wanted to create something at start, we could say debug.log starting So just to make it a bit simpler, we'll delete this command, save that, and once you save it, it'll automatically update in Unity. So now if we hit play, right when it starts it says starting, and then since we don't have nothing in update, it won't say anything else for the remainder. So that's going to conclude the first lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to go way more in depth on Visual Studio and actually coding things in the game. But at the moment, I'd say this is a good place to end the first lesson. So thanks for joining, everyone, and you feel free to play around with all the tools you learned about, or go right to the next lesson if you want.